Thanks a lot, Andrew. I tell you what, I'm really glad to at least virtually be with you all this evening. I can't tell you how much I really wish I was there. A lot of things about Arizona I miss, and all of my friends and colleagues, and getting together and do things like this is certainly one of them. So with that, I think I'm going to just go ahead and jump in. I was telling some of my colleagues here earlier that I've got a lot of material I'm going to try to cover, but I'm going to really do my best to stay on track. And don't have to tell you all right now, much of the West is in very severe drought. And so I think this topic is going to be pretty timely, and hopefully we're going to come away with some useful information for you. If I can get the slides to work. There we go. So the concepts that we're going to talk about today are not just for Arizona or Texas, and they're not just for cattle. These are concepts that can apply across domestic livestock of various species, wildlife. These can be domestic here in the United States or internationally, Asia, South America, Africa. These things are going to be pretty useful for anyone who is managing, researching, learning about, trying to steward resources that have to do with herbivores, grazing animals around the world. We're going to start with a little bit of science to kind of set the stage here. What we're going to be talking about is going to be principles that will work on both sides of what we've always known as the plant-animal interface. I've kind of expanded that a little bit to give it a little broader and deeper spatial and temporal scale. So we call it the environment-animal interface. And basically what this is saying is that effects that may happen at the cellular, molecular, organ system level in an animal may cross that interface and have effects or be affected by various scales on the plant side. Again, down to maybe the cellular level on the plant, all the way up to a landscape scale, and vice versa. So I really just kind of want you to think holistically here tonight. Let's think about the whole picture about how animals interact with their environment and affect that environment, how that environment sets the stage for the life, the physiology, the well-being of those animals, works both ways back and forth across that interspace or that interface. So this is a little bit simplistic, but I think it will help us kind of set the stage. Our rangelands, the condition that they're in, their function, how they are sustained or not, really driven by, especially in the West and the Southwest, three primary drivers or disturbances or stressors, if you want to think of them that way: fire, herbivory, and drought. Now I'm going to use drought here in a little bit broader sense to mean weather of any kind in the short term, climate in the long term. But drought is always an attention getter, and it's kind of the poster child for weather, drought, and how that affects our management and our stewardship. And again, we are currently in a drought. So herbivory is just plant tissue removal by some other organism. That can be an insect, that can be a mammal, reptile, bird, anything that is consuming, taking material from that plant. That is herbivory. Now, if we're going to manage this, if we're going to understand it and how herbivory is going to work on both sides of that environment-animal interface that we talked about, we're typically going to start with some measurement of quantity. We can do that with hoops, with quadrats, with tapes that we put on the ground. We make measurements. We determine how many plants are there, what type of plants are there, the biomass of those plants, and then we can scale that up to kilograms per hectare, pounds per acre, whatever type of units that we're working in. This is how much forage, or sometimes we'll think of this as cover or other habitat parameters that are providing resources for herbivores, out on that land. Doesn't necessarily have to be what they're consuming, but we'll talk about it in terms of forage tonight. The other part of this equation then, a little harder to get at, is forage quality. That's basically going to be just the nutrient density of some unit, dry matter weight unit of plant material. Protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals. Big ticket items. We're going to talk primarily tonight, for the sake of time, on the macro end of that scale with protein and energy. Now, Andrew, here's where some of your credibility comes in, because I'm sure that some of these folks have heard you talking about sack lunches versus box lunches over the last few years. Well, this is where this comes from. If animals have the ability to be selective in the forage that they're taking, they will typically choose new versus old material, live over dead, and leaf versus stem. Now you can look at the side oats grama and you can see some examples of all of that here. And you can see that there's been some grazing that has taken place. These animals have selected primarily new live leaf. This new live leaf is going to represent, if we're thinking about ruminants, more of a sack lunch arrangement in what those cells that make up that plant material are providing to those microbes in the rumen. Sack lunch being cells that have thinner cell walls, less structural carbohydrates, easier for those microbes to tear into those and release the cell contents, where a lot of the nitrogenous part comes from. So the new live leaf, the sack lunch type arrangement, would represent a low carbon nitrogen ratio material. The old dead stem, as you can see some of the browner material here in this photo, would represent more of a box lunch, thicker cell walls, more structural carbohydrates, less of the cytoplasm and other nitrogenous nutritional components, enzymes, photosynthetic enzymes that would be released from that quote unquote box lunch by those microbes in the rumen. All of this then is going to be what helps meet those nutritional requirements for a grazing animal. These animals have to get up every day. They have to maintain their body. Heart needs to pump. Needs to be energy for lungs to inhale, exhale, muscles to move. These animals need to reproduce. If we're talking economics, for those of us in the livestock side of things, we need to create calves, sheep. We're going to need to make lambs, goats, kids. They need to reproduce so that we have something to market. Wild population needs to be able to maintain that population. They have to reproduce themselves. We're talking about mammals. Obviously, they need to have the ability to lactate. They need energy, protein for that, produce that milk. Growth. This young calf is going to have to grow to maturity to either be a marketable animal or to return into that reproductive herd. And then in some cultures and some species of animals, they're going to have to work in addition to all of these items above. And then again, some animals, sheep, Angora goats, camels, yaks, they're going to have to produce fiber as well. All of that takes nutrition to meet those needs. Now this is what I like to refer to as a Goldilocks cow. We're going to kind of start bringing some of these concepts together into hopefully some meaningful discussion here. This cow is not too fat and she's not too thin. So this forage environment in North Texas up along the Red River has been adequate to meet her nutritional needs. You can see some calves there in the background. She's been able to reproduce. She's been able to raise a calf. And although the quality is probably not great, a little more box lunches at this point, it's been adequate to meet the needs of where she is in her life cycle right now. Not too thin, not too fat, kind of just right. So there is a publication from the U of A Cooperative Extension that will help you if you have not gained this ability to be able to numerically quantify body condition in your livestock. It's easy for us typically to tell a thin cow from a fat cow or sheep or goat. Sometimes it's a little harder for us to assign a numerical value to that. With cattle, we typically go on a 1 to 9 scale. And so in this publication, you'll see animals that are 4 on the top, 5 in the middle, and a 6 on the bottom. Okay, why does that matter? It matters because the nutrition that is provided to those animals from that forage quantity and quality out there, those combination of sack lunches and box lunches, and how many of those are there, and are we meeting their needs, is going to be what results in body condition, the amount of fatness in those animals going from the thin to the fat end of that scale. And that is important because that is going to affect their ability to perform, reproduce, grow, do the things that we need them to do from an economic standpoint or on the wildlife side of things for the population to be maintained. Now, almost every state extension service and international organizations dealing with animal nutrition around the world will have a chart that looks something like this. This is the effective body condition score, BCS, at the time of calving on the subsequent reproduction of a group of beef cows. Percent pregnant on the Y scale. Body conditions of 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and you can see that the bars gradually go higher in the percent pregnancy as the animals go from a thin to a fat condition. And actually, if we carried that out to an 8 or 9, that curve would typically flatten out and sometimes even drop off. Animals can get a little too much body condition to be effective at reproducing. So let's circle back now and talk about this biological relationship between that plant structure and what it's providing to the animals, because this is key and it's going to be a lot of what we base the rest of our discussion about. Indian ricegrass plant here has a combination of green material, new live leaf, old dead stem, sack lunches, and box lunches, providing that to those rumen microbes. All relates back to that plant cell structure, and the amount of structural carbohydrates in the cell wall versus the cytoplasm and the other more nitrogenous-based nutrients, again, in those enzymes and photosynthetic enzymes, some of the organelles that would be the more protein, nitrogen type of components in that cell. So the carbon-nitrogen ratio of this cell, just aggregated up to the plant scale, is going to be what determines the amount and the quality of the nutrition that's provided to the animal. So one of my favorite topics, cow pies. We can learn a lot from these things. This particular picture was taken in the middle of the V-Bar-B ranch there near Camp Birdie. This was about 5,000 feet, late May, early June, probably, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago. These cow pies are about a week old. And at the time that the cow was consuming the forage that produced these cow pies, pretty good level of nutrition. These pies hit the ground and spread. So that would have been indicative of a diet that was pretty high quality, pretty low carbon nitrogen ratio. So more sack lunches relative to box lunches in those plants. Now, you can see the Western wheatgrass in this photo. Western wheatgrass, one of my favorite teaching tools because of the color that it changes during its phenology. A week ago, when those cow pies hit the ground, that Western wheatgrass would have been much greener, earlier in its phenology, more lush, more new live leaf. As it has started through that color change now, the pies that would hit the ground from the cows consuming that plant material would look more like those two cow pies stacked on top of each other. Lower diet quality, lower digestibility, higher carbon nitrogen ratio, more structural carbohydrates, thicker cell walls, more box lunches. So think about all of that now as we shift into some of these further topics. And let's talk about drought. What I'm going to show you here is 100 years worth of data from the Sonora research station where I live now. The graph is set up for the standardized precipitation index, and these are basically standard deviations above and below a long-term average, which is represented by the 0 line here. So the blue bars would be above normal annual precipitation, so wet years. Red bars would be dry years. Some things stand out about this. First of all is that weather changes year to year, season to season, climate changes over time. You can see that the variability up and down in this over the last 100 years has been pretty dramatic. And if you look at that series of red negative dry years in the 1950s, this was the historic drought for this part of the world, even more than the Dust Bowl in the 30s. The drought of the 50s, there are people still alive talking about that in this part of the world. The other thing that stands out is if you look through the 1960s, 70s through the early 2000s, is look at how the magnitude of variation shrinks as compared to what it was before that drought of the 50s. Most of us my age have experienced this level of variation in our careers, not that which was previous to that drought, until the last 20 years. Look at the far right end of this graph and look at the amount of variation that we're experiencing now, and that most of the younger people who are taking on ranching, range management, natural resource management into the future, this is probably what you're going to be dealing with. Why does that matter? Well, again, we know that weather changes, climate changes. It always has. It always will. We can argue back and forth about why. We can argue about what to do about it, but we can't argue about the fact that it happens and that we have to deal with it. And it's going to affect how the forage environment is going to provide nutrition for our grazing animals. This is a paper that was published about 10 years ago now. We looked at about 20,000 fecal samples that were scanned with near-infrared spectroscopy to predict the diet quality of those animals. These were animals that were only grazing, not being fed. And we had them geo-referenced, located from border to border and ocean to ocean across the United States over about a 15-year period. And lo and behold, when we looked at those regions and we looked at mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, higher temperature led to lower diet quality. Lower precipitation led to lower diet quality. Lower diet quality is going to lead to less body condition, less performance in those animals, and possibly the need for more feed to get those animals up to an acceptable level of performance. Now, we've all seen pictures like this relative to drought. Drought stress plants are going to have less mass, less vigorous root systems, so they're going to be less healthy, less productive plants. And we can see that above ground as well. This is a Cytox grama plant. Pictures taken in central Arizona. It's not the same plant, but very close, same location, going from a wet time period, adequate precipitation, good timing relative to the phenology of the plant, young, lush, high quality forage, a lot of sack lunches, providing nutrition, rich and dense material to those animals that would be grazing that, compared to the plant down on the lower left, which is kind of a little bit drier conditions, a little bit of green you can see in there, but some brown and older dead material. And then the plant here on the right, lower side, pretty well drought stricken. And so we can see how the above ground material is going to change just like that that's below ground. And that is what is going to be harvested by our ungulate type animals above the ground. So now let's again start kind of putting a lot of these concepts together. Let's see if we can make some sense out of it and something that you can take home and use. So this picture was taken in the Arizona Strip about this time of year, probably about 6 years or so ago. This cow and I are standing in Arizona. We're looking north into Utah. And I was thinking about her, first calf heifer. She had just had this calf probably 30 minutes before I drove by. And at the time I was kind of thinking about, okay, what's her life going to be like over the next few months as she's trying to live in this environment, this altitude, under that forage environment. Obviously she's been able to reproduce. She's got this calf on the ground. Is she going to be able to lactate enough to make a healthy environment for that calf? Is she going to be able to rebreed? do the things that we require of these cattle in these environments. But then I got thinking a little deeper about that. What was the environment like for that calf while he was still in utero, while the cow was gestating, before he hit the ground? And what does that prenatal programming or perinatal environment, how is that going to affect his ability to then grow and perform? And what might that mean for him or a heifer, if it had been a heifer in her longer productive life? Well, let me show you some pictures of Arizona cows and some Australian calves here to kind of make a point. So the pictures on the right are from a set of 4 calves in Australia. The top picture was when they had been weaned, and the larger calves on the outside would have been produced by cows in a good nutritional environment, and their moms probably looked something like this lower red cow on the left slide, body condition 6. The 2 calves in the middle had come from an inadequate or less nutritionally viable environment, and their moms probably looked something like the body condition 4 cow. That was at weaning. Not surprising. We go about a year and a half later, same 4 calves in the same position through a stocker and a feeding period. Some of that gain and size has been made up by those middle calves, but not all. They had been prenatally programmed to not perform as well, didn't have the muscles, didn't have the machinery, didn't have the enzyme systems to be able to grow and efficiently use that forage compared to their larger counterparts. So let me show you some Arizona data that will make that same point. V-Bar-V Ranch, right in the middle of the state there in Coconino National Forest near Camp Verde, indicated by the red star. The graph on the left is body condition score as an average body condition for a herd of about 400 cows on that ranch through a production year. You can see that there's about a body condition to body condition and a half variation during the year for those cows. Not unusual for range cows. This is 100 years of data, similar to what I showed you from Sonora. This is for the V-Bar-V. This came from the University of Arizona Drought Dashboard. Again, the variability from year to year stands out. Some long wet periods back in the 80s kind of stand out. But look at the last 20 years at the V-Bar-V. Annual rainfall, mostly dry. A few years above average, and there were certainly some seasonal monsoons in particular times during those overall dry years where the timing of rainfall was such that we had some productive forage environments for those animals. But overall pretty dry. Dave Schaefer, when he was there, took data on those cattle and those calves pretty much from conception to consumption. And so we had data on those calves from those wet years during the prenatal and perinatal, the gestation and the lactation period for those calves. And we had some dry periods. When we compared those, we can see that the birth weight, weaning weight, carcass weights were less and tended to be less on those calves produced during that dry time. And if you look at the highlights here, we had less ribeye area on those calves produced during the dry periods than during the wet, less product to sell. On the heifers, we had less pelvic, vertical pelvic area, less room for that calf to be born out of throughout her lifetime. So it's not just about right now. Yes, being dry now is going to affect our conception and our body condition this year in the moment. It's going to affect the ability of those cows to milk, or those deer, those elk. But there are going to be long-lasting effects from these types of wet and dry oscillations that we go through, and the timing of them relative to when these animals are gestating. It's not just an Arizona thing. It happens in wet environments as well. Similar set of data from East Texas, 40 inches of rainfall. This was not a wet and dry comparison. This was a high and low stocking rate comparison. But the low stocking rate animals, cows were in higher body condition. High stocking rate, cows were in lower body condition. Same sort of data. Lower weaning weights, lower heart carcass weights, lower ribeye area. So no matter where that environment is, if those animals are nutritionally compromised during that gestation period, there are going to be long-lasting effects. It's not just about right now. So let me show you an experiment that we did this past summer with some purebred Brahman heifers, growing heifers. Started from that East Texas location by the red star. That was our Overton experiment station. The yellow star is the Sonora station where I am. We transported those heifers, 12 of them, from lush green East Texas to a little bit drier, rockier, hillier Southwest Texas, very similar to some of the pinyon juniper country that you would have there at mid elevations in Arizona. We put GPS collars on those cattle and we're able to look at their grazing behavior. We did a couple of different 1 month sampling periods, 60-acre pastures side by side. So 6 of these heifers for about a month, adequate forage there. And again, similar to some of your PJ country. The control animals are on the left. The treated animals, their dams had been subjected to transportation stress during mid-gestation, multiple 2-hour transportation periods, something that we might see as droughts continue. We start to move animals around. If you look at the concentration of the dots on the blue side, the treated animals, and how they are distributed around that pasture, and especially relative to water, versus the purple dots and how they are concentrated, distributed across the pasture, yes, but concentrated closer to water, there was a very distinct difference between the prenatally stressed animals and the non-stressed animals. Colt Knight, former graduate student at the University of Arizona, worked with us on this project. The statistics that he came up with on those GPS locations showed us that the treated animals in the red bars here were farther away from water. The control animals stayed closer to water. The treated animals traveled more each day than did the control animals. Did not turn into any difference in performance, though. Those animals gained basically the same, both sets throughout the summer on the same type of pasture in close proximity. But I want you to look at this sort of the closest 1/3 of both of those pastures relative to water and look at the concentration of those dots and think about how they would distribute themselves in a much larger pasture, and especially where water was not maybe as distributed as we would like it to be to get a good distribution of grazing across that pasture. And then let's think about what that might mean in a 5, 10, 15-year period. Might we be able to, with a better understanding of how this perinatal stress caused by drought, perhaps, might reflect how those animals will use a landscape in the future. And perhaps we can use those animals who may not grow and thrive as well in a highly productive environment or in those wet years, but they may survive better in those dry years. They may have been fit for harsher times by that harsher environment in utero, and perhaps by utilizing those animals in some of these harsher environments in conjunction with some of our other disturbances, fire and other treatments, we might be able to shift the composition of a landscape over time. We might be able to work on both sides of that environment by animal interface to our advantage, to be better stewards of those animals and of those landscapes. So in summary, drought manifests as water temperature stress and rangeland vegetation, things that we're aware of. Drought stress is expressed as morphological, physiological, biochemical adaptations in both our plants and our animals. The drought's going to have effects on range vegetation. That's ultimately going to affect the quantity and quality of both livestock grazing and wildlife habitat. take-home message. These effects will not only be observed in the current year or season, but will continue to affect the rangeland and those animals as they interact across that interface for years to come. With that, I will stop, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time possibly for some questions.
Yeah, actually you do have one question. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So range utilization this year on Hopi was a bit hard. We had less production. Do these two factors run hand in hand? We had low new growth as well.
Yes, absolutely. You know, the precipitation, the amount, the timing, the distribution, how that relates to the phenology of those plants, the species that you have distributed across your land, absolutely going to have an effect on both the quantity and the quality. And shows here that my battery is running low, which is strange because I'm plugged in. But yes, the rainfall is absolutely going to have a big effect on the production of that forage, and then what that is going to do to provide nutrition, cover, those type of things for your animals.
Okay, so that's great. We've got another question. So what are your thoughts about regenerative management?
Well, I think that's a nice, catchy term for what we've been trying to do for years and years. If we don't do regenerative management, if we're not doing adaptive management, if we're not changing with the times, the hand that's being dealt us, we're not going to be in business very long. We're not going to be good stewards, and our land, our animals are not going to be in very good condition. We all want to pass that off to the next generation in better shape. That is regenerative in my opinion.
Okay, so let's see. We got any last questions? If you got some last questions here, and are you going to be staying on for the rest of the time or not, Doug?
I am, and I'm going to try to determine why my battery is running low since I'm plugged into the wall. So I may have to find a better outlet.
Okay.
But yes, I'm going to stick around.
Okay, so since I don't see any questions right now, I'm going to turn it back to Andrew to introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much, Dr. Tolleson.
You bet. Thank you all for having me.